present today is some thoughts that I've called intangible matters. And it's in this presentation, and I dedicate this presentation to persons who have had horrifying experiences at our caring hands that we've intended to be caring, but have been harmful. I've intended to begin with exposing the implicit or overlooked nuances in neurodiscourse of the soul in the brain, whether the misunderstanding is the immaterial agency and intentionality overlooked by objectified thingification, the inescapable irreducibility ignored by materialistic reductionism, or the nothing but-ism in inseparability of intangible meaning in material biology. I propose that better understanding these intangible matters advances a different kind of evidentialism, or an ethics of what we believe, and an ethics of care. My hope is that this consideration could ease some long-standing feuds between the natural and human sciences regarding, 1, the false dilemma of the mind-body problem, 2, the false analogy of physical medicine applied to the suffering of the soul, and 3, the possibility of a new kind of panpsychism with a postmodern scrubbing, as noted in Catherine Malibu's Plasticity, Martin Heidegger's Being There, Michel Henry's Material Phenomenology, Karen Bard's Interactions, and the feminist wisdom from the new materialism in post-humanistic relational ontology, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty's chiasmic ontology of the flesh, all in 20 minutes, of course. So let's add to this project a discussion of ethical implications of addressing a growing technoneuroism of treatment as engineering, lest we wake up one day and ask, what have we done in a post-human age of the machine, where human beings are more and more viewed as data bytes of information that are programmable, algorithmically engineered, and commodified as products, now all in 15 minutes. So I want to focus on one statement that I hope represents the underlying lines of continental thought without drifting too much into continental obscurity or reducing things to a sleight of hand of scattergrams. I hope that these comments help us understand a new understanding of this particular thought and line. The line, we are our neurons. Rather than fighting against this statement, the statement's unapologetic reductionism and jingle for scientism, which I've spent the last 3 decades battling, I want instead to take up and dwell with this statement, which seems to be the crux or the horcrux of the collision between meaning and matter. I offer a therapoetic read of this impossibility, as only the poet can access the soul, even or especially the soul of, in, or as the neuron. As implied by the comment, we are our neurons, is that we are nothing but our neurons, that any experience we may have is an epiphenomenon of neural activity. As one reductionist put it, quote, everyone knows that the brain is in the head and that the mind is the product of the brain. No brain, no mind. Malfunctioning brain, defective mind. Few, if any, would dispute the assumptions that the brain somehow gives rise to sensation, perception, cognition, volition, and other psychological experiences or states. The persisting challenge is to determine precisely how the brain does this, unquote. In the beginning was the neuron, and the neuron was flesh. The neuron was the unmoved mover. The mind and the soul are nothing but the brain. In a recent study, it's estimated that 95% of psychologists believe this is to be true. Even Malibu herself noted that we are our synapses, quote unquote. I have been one of the so-called few that have challenged this assumption, but today I want to go celebrate this statement as unwittingly underlying what I and others who think similarly with me have been saying all along. Let's toast and praise whatever gods there may be that we are our neurons. Well, let's take a closer look at what that means. Here is the surprise, which shouldn't be a surprise given that we live it out every moment of our lives, even though we walk right past it, or like the Zen monk who is riding an ox, looking for an ox. Neurons are hermeneutes. They receive, give, and communicate, discern, intend, act, sometimes excite, and sometimes withhold or suppress. They are co-constituting collaborators. A neuron is a relationship, an intertwining, a chiasm, an interdependency. Neurons are not objects to grasp, that's gray matter. A neuron is an experience, an event of communication in and with the world. But as Maurice Merleau-Ponty reminds us, we can't see what organizes and holds these processes together. It is invisible. Michel Henry noted it more boldly, quote, "Life is invisible, science can't study it," unquote. Levinas follows with a reminder that the face can neither be seen nor touched. Jean-Luc Marianne's commentation on Michel Henry and Levinas notes that my life cannot be seen because it will not let itself be aimed at. Invisible, not because it withdraws and conceals itself, because it moves so far into me that it coincides with me and that I have no means of aiming at it in distance from myself. Invisible, because in the visible, quote unquote. Eastern non-dualists would agree, even as early as the 3rd century. This is how we are our neurons. We are in a proverbial pickle then if the headliner of our topic is about new technologies in treating a physically empirical organ, particularly if our neurons are intangible, as much as Levinas's face is not mere epidermis, nor Henri's life mere blood, bones, and cartilage, nor soul merely the locomotion of a skeleton. But neither is the neuron as us disembodied. Two ways of thinking have to shift. One is the reductive conflation of physicalism with animism, and the other is the reductive relationship between them being causal. The neuron is an experience, not a thing. Chemistry and voltage are the means such experiences occur and which alter themselves in like kind in dialogue with experience, that is, lived meaning. As to causation, correlation, and as they continue to be collapsed erroneously, we find ourselves as much as how the significance of events call out neural firing rather than cause them. When Agnes saw me on the ward in the hospital post-neurosurgery and threw her arms around me, bursting into tears, the event of fear, confusion, and unknowing called forth her tears. ECT murdered the means by which Janice and I registered the memory of our pre-surgical consultation and conversation, which entailed talking about a relationship with her kids and her vocation as a seamstress. But this conversation occurred in the world, not in her head. We can measure water from a duck, but not tears, or measure EKG waves, but not heartbreak. We can measure EEGs, but not a monster with red eyes in a little girl's dream. We can attend to ocular nerve health, but not wonder. Pointing to the brain as the cause of these experiences is like pointing to a carburetor to explain the cause of a family vacation. Measuring soul with imaging is like cooking spaghetti with a vacuum cleaner. Wrong task with the wrong tool. We are our neurons, but neurons are that which is experienced, not seen, not objectified. Neurons are the tears, heartbreak, terror, wonder, hope. We know these experiences to be true and real for us all, but then reach to explain them by pointing to gray matter. This is what Alfred North Whitehead called the error of misplaced concreteness. Aging discloses a neuron's mourning when connections lag or lack, when the name for one's daughter can't be found, and when one can't remember the word dementia. Neurons can be unwittingly savage and relentless in painful firing for Angie, a trigeminal neuralgia patient who tries not to claw at her face during what she calls an attack, as neurons for her are experienced as terrorist, at least for 23 minutes until morphine lulls them to sleep. Other everyday examples abound. The lonely synapse waits for Godot, while the conversation with a good friend at the right time, in the right way, floods the synapse. The neuron fires and can fire with varying intensity. It receives firing that can excite or suppress. It communicates. But what message is carried and by what or whom? How does the neuron know when to fire or how intensely to fire? How do we read the incoming messages or send meaningful responses? The neuron interprets. It has soul. It is incarnate. The plastic brain reformulates in light of meaningful experience. Too anthropomorphic? I say not enough. If we are merely adding anthropomorphic topping to the mere facts of neural firing, aren't our neurons desiring to do so? To say that this is firing, not desiring, is itself a hermeneutical framing, not a discovery of an essentialist capital T truth. But if one must stay with just the facts, remember that a fact is always and already in a context of meaningful significance, again, a hermeneutical circuit, or we would not be able to understand it as a fact, understanding being, of course, another hermeneutical process. We will not be able to get behind, under, around, or in front of hermeneutics. This is the point of radical hermeneutics in postmodernity. It is all the way down. The fact of this neuron is that it is communal, hermeneutical, discernful, urgent, intentional, organizational, provocative. We don't have to be speciesist and call these experiences human experiences, as these are cross-species existential givens, though perhaps the homunculi thesis may have been right after all. But one fact remains. These qualities and comportments are intangible, though arguably are what makes life matter, not as matter, but intangibly matter as significant. Merleau-Ponty's chiasmic ontology of the flesh frames what has been a false dilemma of mind versus body and advances how we are as neurons. Merleau-Ponty notes that, quote unquote, what might be considered to be psychology is in fact ontology. The phenomenality of the neuron is a materially real condition, notes Michel Henry, but not seen in the light of exteriority. It is experienced in lived suffering and joy, which Henri talks about as the tissue of life. Even seeing is only as an unseeing, Henri quotes, in not relating to itself in a seeing, in not revealing itself through a seeing, and thus as unseen, invisible, that seeing effectuates itself, unquote. This is an Emmaus phenomenon where we are aware of what is with us, in us, sustaining us, and calling us in any and every event, but vanishes when we turn to see it. This incarnation is not a classic ghost in the machine, nor a substance dualism, nor merely qualia. It can't be engineered, nor marketed, nor commodified. It can't be grasped except in error. Its evidence is the most evident of all evidence, as that it's 100% in each moment of our lives, but cannot be operationalized, nor objectified, nor countered, nor typically measured. Every attempt at naming leaves a remainder of what cannot be named or reified. Pointing at it misses it, as it is not an it. We know what I'm referring to, even if we cannot know how I can know, even though what I'm referring to cannot be known if by known we mean epistemological conclusiveness, classification, operationalization, or repeatability. Unless they are wounded, the neurons know which transmitters to send where. But when we look for this knowability, we can't point to it. And perhaps more importantly, the neuron stands in the clearing, uncertain and unknowing of the coming of the other, of what might be perhaps a crisis. An elating comfort depends on its situation's hermeneutical discernment, which occurs at 270 miles an hour or 120 meters per second. The neuron is much like Maurice Blanchot's description of the phenomenality of light. Quote, "The work of light is accomplished only when light makes us forget that something like light is at work," unquote. The ethics of evidentialism, or our justification for claiming to know what we know, includes accounting for the evidence that is intuited but not seen, experienced but not measurable. The unknowable must be woven into what we consider evidence for care to avoid being hermeneutically violent via epistemic injustice. This calls for an epistemic humility of being more public about what we do not know as unknowable. Nor can the ethics of evidentialism be excused from owning this epistemic humility by conjuring Wittgenstein's invitation to just pass over what we can objectify or control in science or in silence. Epistemic humility also means embracing ontological undecidability that challenges taken for granted if this, then this algorithmic treatment. Undecidability shows us that if this, then maybe that, or something else. If this, then this and that, and something else. If we truly want to care, then attend to the hermeneut. In all its radicality, as the hermeneut is the neuron and the neuron is us. Now for an off-the-chain parting comment and suggestion. The beginning and end of my concerns today rest on the question, how can I care well for the psychiatric survivor's suffering or extreme experiences and the institutions of care that have harmed her by technologies of care unwittingly for such extreme experiences that are based on presumptions of relationship between the mind and the brain. The ethics of technique, off of which we employ technology based on this evidentialism, is that which allows life in Henri's sense of the word to happen. To care, we have to ease up at the very least on genuflecting to outcome thinking. As long as technique is a utility to serve outcomes as productions, then that or whom we call for will be seen as commodities to serve this archy or write-off, or seen as write-offs in this way. Can the technoneuroism give way to, or at least allow room for, caring without why? Paraphrasing Angelus Silesius, the medieval poet so influential on Meister Eckhart and subsequently Martin Heidegger, a neuron is without why. It fires because it fires. It gives and receives without making itself the message, nor does it ask if anyone sees it, nor does it ask if anyone to see it serve. O neurologist, as long as you know, have, and see, you have not been delivered, believe me, of your burden. Thank you very much.